And I think my journey carried me through a little bit more of an unconventional path to discovering my purpose, because that's what I needed to experience so that I could lead men after me. We always go through what we're going to give. You got to go through it to give it. And I think that's why my story played out the way it did. But if you look at every man's story, which I love talking to men and finding out about their stories. That's why I started a podcast, because there's so many good stories out here. Let's catch them. That if you listen to any man who is upright with a heartbeat and is breathing air into his body at the age of 25, 30, 35, 40, they've been through some incredible stuff. You don't make it that far in life without going through something. And a lot of us downplay that. A lot of us downplay that because we're constantly looking around and comparing ourselves to the next man.
Welcome back to Open Up with Lockie Samuel, into episode 122 with my man, Jeddy Azuma, who I've been told has one of the most beautiful energies around. You've been talked up a lot, bro, so I've been super excited to do this. And I should say that you are the founder of the Rising Man Movement and host of the Rising Man podcast. So for anyone who doesn't know who you are, which in this space, I'm not too sure if it's possible, but for anyone who doesn't know who you are, could you please, I guess, give a brief overview of who you are and what you do?
Yeah, well, thank you, Lockie. It's an honor to be here. And whoever told you about my energy, man, I'm humbled. I'm truly
humbled. It was
humbled.
Lexi and Preston, bro.
Oh, wow. Well,
and Leon.
Even more humbled. All people that I love. Yeah, I love what I do. I love being able to have these conversations. And most of all, because when I introduce myself, I always make sure I mention that I'm a husband and a father, because those are the two most important jobs in my life. And frankly, everything else I do is just icing on top. If I'm not doing fatherhood and being a husband in the best way that I can, then to me, it doesn't matter. To me, I'm missing the point. If I'm focused on other things before those two, then it doesn't carry as much meaning for me. So those are my two favorite jobs. And I also just get to have a lot of wonderful conversations with men, whether it's on the podcast or coaching guys one-on-one. I do a lot of group leadership work online, especially now with the whole COVID thing that we're in the middle of. But my bread and butter is really in rites of passage. I really believe that the world is missing initiated men who have been initiated into power and purpose and know what it means to go through hardship and challenge in order to live a fulfilling and service-oriented life. So that's the direction that my compass has been pointed in, and where the service continues to call me into.
That's amazing. And that first statement about the being a husband and a father straight up just landed, like definitely resonates with me, and I know it'll resonate with a lot of men who forget to prioritize what is truly important in a bid to, I guess, attain some sort of achievement or success for that external validation. So, like hit me in my feels straight away, bro.
Yeah. And I don't know if, have you read The Way of the Superior Man by David Data? Are you familiar with that book?
Just going through the audiobook. Yeah.
Okay, great. Well, I read that book for the first time when I was 21, and I had no idea what he was talking about. And then I reread it again when I was 27, right before I got married. And I think it's chapter 10 or 11. He talks about a man must make his mission more important than anything in his life. And that seemed to go against everything I ever thought. So I had mentioned that because being a father and being a husband is a massive part of my mission, but it's not the entirety of my vision. It's not the entirety of what I'm here to do. And so it's a weird juxtaposition where in order to take care of my family, I must focus my attentions on my highest pursuit and making an impact in the world, and never forget who it's really for. And it's this really bizarre juxtaposition, like I said, of trying to balance those two realities. And I mentioned that because it's been very present for me, and I know a lot of guys have been in conversation about that recently.
That's awesome, bro. Like I said to you beforehand, and listening to some of your podcasts, it feels like you're this grounded presence, and just the way you show up, even in the first couple of minutes of this, it feels like that as well. So I just want to acknowledge that in you, bro, because that's nice to have a man that shows up in that way.
Yeah. Well, you should go back and listen to the first couple of podcast episodes that I did, or the first couple of Facebook lives I did back in, I don't know, 2017. I was just talking about that today with someone, by the way, someone who I was talking to had done their first Instagram live, and he was so excited, and he said, "Oh, it was so hard. I was so nervous. My palms were sweaty." And I was like, "Wow, I remember what that feels like." And I've gone back and listened to myself. It's all repetitions, man. None of us are all that special. We all have given talents, but those talents don't become anything unless we nurture them. And so I appreciate that acknowledgement. To me, it's confirmation that I've been really sharpening and honing my craft. But just go back a couple of years, man, and I'm tumbling all over the place. It's good to have a good laugh at yourself.
um, I think you've already partially answered this, but this is usually like the question I lead with for all the interviews, which is, could you describe the way you view yourself as a man and or human?
Ooh, the way I view myself. As far back as I can remember, I've always been a man who has valued community. When I was 9 years old, my mom was diagnosed with breast cancer, and I have a younger brother who was 3 years old at the time, and an older brother who was 18, 19 at the time. So, and then my dad was working full time to support us. And the only way, and I mean this, the only way that I was able to survive that emotionally, mentally as a 9 year old was that some of my closest friends and their families completely took me in during that
Wow.
time. I mean, my mom was going through treatments. There was periods of time where she was in the hospital for weeks, months at a time. And my friends' parents took me in. It's to the point where every day after school, I had a different house to go to, and they would feed me dinner. And I would hang out there till I started falling asleep. And then my dad would pick me up and bring me home after he had gone to visit my mom in the hospital after work. And it didn't make that connection until I was in my mid 20s, because I just, from that point forward, I'd always valued having people around and seeing the power of what a family is capable of when there's other families around to support. But looking back on it, that was where it all started for me. So when you ask me how I view myself as a man, I'm a man who builds community around myself, because to me, that's the way we're supposed to do it. That's the way we're biologically engineered to cohabitate together. And I'm also a man of ceremony and deep devoted intention and purpose. And in my life, that's become this beautiful combination of taking men out into the wilderness and sitting up in teepee ceremonies and praying with plant medicines, and then also tending fires for various Native American ceremonies, and just supporting prayer, supporting the right for people to pray and express themselves out loud in a reverent way, and raising this next generation with those values that I didn't have growing up. Growing up, I grew up in the suburbs of New York City, man. It was all about football, baseball, and macaroni and cheese. And I never heard about peyote until I was in my 20s, man. So giving my children and my nieces and nephews a different life than I got, not because I believe I had a bad one, but because I believe this is a better way to have community around them and to have aunties and uncles around them who love them and who can give them something different than just their parents. That's the kind of man that I am.
I'm curious. That's a good answer, by the way.
Thanks.
I'm curious. What culture are you? Is it Native American? Is that what it's called?
No, I'm not native by blood. My dad's side of the family is from Japan, and my mom's side of the family is from Italy.
Oh
So
wow.
I was born here in the States, but my ethnicity goes back to Japan and Italy and a little bit of the Middle East.
Okay. I was just going to ask if there was any disconnection between the culture and being brought up in a city environment, but
Well, truthfully, I mean, the culture that my grandparents came over to the United States with was, and this is something I talk about a lot on my podcast and in my work, is the consequence of so many people in the colonial U.S. who have had our ancestral ties completely severed. Most of us don't know, myself included, I don't know anything about my ancestry past my great grandparents. So that's 4 generations. And to me, and it's just a little bit. I know folks, especially some of my close brothers that you know on your side of the world who are Maori and have that lineage. They know 16, 17 generations back, and I'm blown away by that. I can't even fathom that. They know the names of their ancestors, and for me, the fact that I don't know that I don't speak Japanese or Italian, I speak more Spanish than either of those languages, and I do feel disconnected a bit from what I received. Part of it's in the DNA, though. I felt it activated along my journey. But then also, the thing that's always made most sense to me is a spirituality that's connected to the earth. And that's what I get from studying in these Native American and indigenous ways. There's always a connection to the earth and the elements, and looking around me for spirit and God instead of looking into a book or into the past.
That's awesome, man. That's connection.
Yeah,
Um,
for me it is.
you touched on throughout the childhood having to go through like your mum being sick and then going around all these different families and the positives within being, I guess, or becoming a man who values community and who can build community because of how he was raised and what he went through. Were there ever any, I guess, was there ever any sense of the warping of your perspective of what a relationship is to be because it was sort of thrown into chaos so young?
I never thought about it that way. I think that we all get what we witness, whether you come from a broken home where your father or your mother wasn't present, single parent household, maybe you were raised by grandparents or a guardian, or maybe like me, your parents are still married and living in the same house that you grew up in. Um, and obviously, that's such a large spectrum. So, do I think that my experience was warped by that? I do think that I experienced some very unique trauma at that age. I don't think that most children come close to losing a parent at that age. And so, and 4 years prior to that, I lost my grandfather, my paternal grandfather, my dad's dad, very suddenly. And he was my superstar of my world at that time in my life. So I do think I had an experience of death at a very young age. It's interesting you asked that because, especially amidst this whole COVID thing, the past 5 to 10 years of my life, I've always felt like I'm a bit more desensitized to chaos and death, especially death, where to the point where I thought there was something wrong with me because people would talk about folks that are dying. And I just have a little bit more of a logical, pragmatic viewpoint of it. There's life and there's death. People die, even people close to me. I've lost plenty of people that were close to me, and it's impacted people around me a lot more than me. So I don't know if that's because of what I experienced at a young age. I don't know if it's because I'm a little bit desensitized to it, or if it's just the way I operate and the way I see the world. Because I've had near death experiences myself. I've been around death. I've been in rooms where people have passed away. And it's actually a beautiful process. It's sad for the people who stay behind, but it's such a moment of feeling alive for the folks who are left behind. You really appreciate just what life is when you see life leave someone else. So
Can we dig into that a little bit? That, I guess, the beauty of death, because I can assume that people would be hearing that and going, "What the fuck is he talking about? Death
probably.
is not beautiful." Because we
Probably.
associate death with grief, and in some cases like years and decades of grief. So the idea of death being beautiful is probably like a contradiction to most people's beliefs.
Yeah. And truthfully, I can only speak to it from my own novice perspective of it. But I recently had a guest on the Rising Man podcast named Stephen Jenkinson. And this is his life's work. And he's so articulate and poetic about how he speaks of death. And he actually defends death to the people who write it off. He speaks of death as something that we've desanctified and in a sense disrespected the process of death. And even when you look at us as a society, the whole medical infrastructure is designed to extend life, not to develop a higher quality of it. You know, Western medicine is all about prolonging life. It's not about maximizing the quality while we have it. So anyway, if you guys are interested more about death, let's definitely go check out Stephen Jenkinson. But just my perspective on it is that things are living and dying around us all the time. We're just so far removed from it because we live in these perpendicular boxes called houses, and we separate our properties by fences, and we don't sit around fires anymore together. We're so disconnected from the natural world, so disconnected from the natural world, and so afraid of the things that are natural. Bare feet on the earth, you know, jumping into a cold river, all these things that are very natural to every other species. And to us, it's become some major event, you know, like cold water plunges. That's how animals bathe. I mean, it's just as uncomfortable for me as it is for anyone else. But I mean, sometimes I like to look at nature as a backdrop for how humans are. And if you compare a human species to every other species, we are absolutely the oddballs. We are so freaking weird in the way that we operate here. It's almost comical when you think about it. So not to say that that's wrong. I just think that a lot of these perceptions we have around life and death are undeserved. There's nothing wrong with death other than it's a completion of something.
It's amazing. And I think that going back to like having the circles and having that space is an awesome segue into like what you wanted to touch on was your mid-20s and like really having no sense of purpose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you know, a really good segue into that is just death is a metaphor, right? Because there's actual death of ceasing to exist in human form. But what I mentioned before, that what I'm really into is rites of passage. And a rite of passage, by definition, is a death and a rebirth. It's a completion of one chapter and the beginning of another. It's a completion of a cycle and the beginning of another cycle. So in my 20s, having no idea of what a rite of passage was, having I hadn't sat in sweat lodge yet. I hadn't prayed in front of a fireplace. I was just I was just new to meditation and Zen Buddhism, very, very new. And at the same time, I was also enjoying being an adolescent, you know, thinking that I was becoming a man and having all of these abilities to do whatever the fuck I wanted, you know, really just to do what I wanted. I was smoking weed, I was smoking tobacco, going out and partying. And I look back on that and I don't think I was doing anything wrong or anything I shouldn't. But what it wasn't doing is it wasn't fulfilling for me at all. It was these momentary pleasures that gave me a distraction from the deeper pain that I was feeling. The deeper pain was that I didn't know what my life was for. I really had no idea. And I couldn't articulate that because I didn't really have any mentors who suggested my life had a purpose. The authority that I followed at that time was college and university and go to school, get a degree, get a job, mortgage, house, 2.5 kids, the whole formula that I'd witnessed my whole life growing up, but it never felt right. I was always the odd one out. I'm like, I don't know about that. It doesn't really sound like what I'm up for. And so I had to really plunge into that darkness because I didn't have another coping mechanism. I didn't have another outlet for my pain. So I numbed myself like most of us do when we don't have another option. And that was really the beginning of a death. That was like, if I had like a metaphorical illness, it was me shedding that adolescent skin. And it was really, really uncomfortable, really painful, really dark, really lonely at times, because I didn't find my mentors for another 4 or 5 years. The men that I first sat in circle with and the men who brought me out to the mountain to fast for 4 days and to claim my adulthood. I didn't come to that. So that was a long time to suffer alone on that journey. But I also think it was necessary. I wouldn't appreciate it the way I do now if I hadn't had that.
Yeah, exactly. It's similar, not to downplay, I guess, the suffering throughout childhood, but similar to what you went through with your mum, I guess, would have made you grateful for life. And have that sort of belief around death being beautiful.
Hmm. Yeah, and I was, and to paint a more clear picture of who I was always the shining star in the room. I was always Mr. Optimism, Mr. Let's get along and make the world a better place. Kumbaya, let's hold hands, and we're going to heal the planet. But part of that pain was that I didn't know how to contribute. I didn't know how to help heal the planet. And when I started to see what the planet looked like, when you go around the world to these different countries, I was very, very disappointed and very, very hurt and very sad. And it felt too big for me to do anything about. I'm talking about when I was 21, 22, 23, really up until 25, when I said enough is enough. I got to get out of New York City and I got to go somewhere where people that are a little bit older than me with a little more experience can help me figure out what the heck I'm supposed to be doing with my life, because I have no idea. What I'm doing right now isn't working. That's all I know. And
Wow.
yeah, that
Where
started
does
a journey.
where does that inner desire to find out, I guess, what you're here for, what you're meant for, what your purpose is, being someone who is going through that suffering? Was it just the fact that you were someone who did push back against like societal expectation?
I think that was my path. I don't think it looks like that for everyone. I believe I was always meant to serve a higher purpose than having a family and being a good contributing citizen in my community. And that's not to downplay that, because I think that is also a very worthy mission. Like I mentioned at the top of the show, I wouldn't start off by saying I'm a husband and a father if I didn't think those were two of the most important jobs in the world. That's plenty. If you can be an awesome husband and an awesome father and raise some awesome badass kids, like badass in a good way, then I think you've already done your job. For me, that was never going to be the stopping point, though. I always knew there was going to be more than that. And I think my journey carried me through an a little bit more of an unconventional path to discovering my purpose, because that's what I needed to experience so that I could lead men after me. We always go through what we're going to give. You got to go through it to give it. And I think that's why my story played out the way it did. But if you look at every man's story, which I love talking to men and finding out about their stories. That's why I started a podcast, because there's so many good stories out here. Let's catch them. That if you listen to any man who is upright with a heartbeat and is breathing air into his body at the age of 25, 30, 35, 40, they've been through some incredible stuff. You don't make it that far in life without going through something. And a lot of us downplay that. A lot of us downplay that because we're constantly looking around and comparing ourselves to the next man. So, to answer your question, I don't think it has to be that way. It was that way for me. And every single one of us has gone through something extraordinary. In fact, if you're listening and you're one of those guys who's in his 20, 25, 30, 35, and you don't feel so great about your life, just feel grateful that you've made it this far, and appreciate and celebrate the things that you've made it through. Don't stop. Don't rest on your laurels. But I know for me, I always under acknowledge myself for what I've been through and how far I've come.
How have you worked through that? Is that a good segue into like the uninitiated man, which is like another point you wanted to cover, and going through like a rites of passage process to be able to, I guess, step into or embody a man who can celebrate himself?
Yeah, I think I consider the work I've done with the podcast and everything that's Rising Man related to really have been a research project up to this point. Just a deep dive research into what's really happening. What is the state of man around the world right now? That's been my biggest discovery. And what I hypothesized in the beginning is that I would discover that we actually aren't that different from each other. There's details to our stories. And what I found to be true is that every man has, we often call it a mask nowadays, but some sort of veil or some sort of armor that he is forged over the years to protect him, to protect himself from outside ridicule, um, authority from his parents and other people, and wanting to just survive in the world. That's something that we learn to do. But as soon as that's stripped away, as soon as you can create an environment and a context in which a man feels safe enough to let that go, what you find is that there is just a soft, fleshy, pulpy heart that wants to give back to the world. So when we talk about uninitiated man, to me, an uninitiated man is a man who hasn't felt safe enough to expose his tender heart to other men, to his community, to the world. And that part of the initiation process is having the courage to expose that tender heart and also put yourself through a ceremonial trial, a challenge to see just how strong you are. Because in order to live a life of purpose, especially big purpose, you've got to be resilient. You've got to have a backbone. You got to have a spine in this world. And this is what indigenous peoples and tribal peoples have done for thousands, tens of thousands, millions of years, is these rites of passage that prepared boys to give back to the community as men. I often say the difference between boys and men is that boys take from the community and men give back to it. It's
Ooh,
a
I like that.
180-degree turn, and that's natural. Boys are meant to take from the community. They're meant to take, that's, from the moment that their mothers give them milk from the breast, right to that threshold where they can step across and turn back and reach their hand out to help. That was the signature mark of, you're ready to be a man. You're ready to have a family. You're ready to be a warrior, a hunter, a provider for your family and for your community. And most of us don't get that. We don't get that in our upbringing. I don't know about you, where you grew up, but most young men, most boys, don't have a context or a notion that that's even available, because their parents and their uncles never got that. We've broken that sequence of passing the torch from one generation to the next a long time ago. And so my mission is really to reignite that flame and start that tradition, that culture all over again, and just pick up where we left off.
That's amazing, man. And I agree. It's I think especially with colonization and like rapid colonization, especially in New Zealand, like where I'm from, it's, I guess what I can speak into is that people, especially in our village, like my grandparents had the language beaten out of them, taken over by the Catholic Church, and therefore they had that disconnection from culture. And so my granddad, my koro, always used to say, if we were speaking the language, why are you talking that shit?
Mm.
Because he was so disconnected and ashamed of the culture that he had to get it out of us as well. And
Mm.
so now I'm going through this phase where I'm like, oh shit, I need to tap back into that and relearn the language so I
Yeah.
know who I am.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, the language, that's just one component, right? The
Mm,
dances, the songs, the stories, the creation myths of how different tribes of people came to be on this planet, and the migration patterns and all of that, man, there's so much rich history. And the greatest travesty is that we have over a decade of history that we teach kids in school, 5 days a week, 6 hours a day, they're getting fed information, and it's completely devoid of the truth about our people and where we come from.
yeah,
Wouldn't that
it's
be such a rich history to have? Know where you come from, and know. I mean, I think that's really a big contributor to why we become teenagers and young adults who don't know who we are, because we don't know where we came from. We don't know our ancestors. We don't know our songs. We don't know our dances. We don't know. We don't eat traditional foods, and that's a broad stroke. I'm saying we. Obviously, it's not everybody, but most of us don't have that. Most of us
yeah.
don't have that.
I think there'd be too many people asking too many questions if we were taught about our cultures and about the wisdom that they held.
Yeah. Well, what do you mean by that? When you say too many questions, what do you mean by
Too
that?
many questioning the norms, the societal
Ah, yeah.
norms right now. Yeah,
Sure. Sure. Well, it definitely has created a very convenient linear model of going through an educational system and becoming a worker bee.
yeah. When you're talking about now men have this mask or armor, what was the armor that you had, and like what was the process for you in relinquishing that and going through, I guess, initiation or ceremony?
Hmm. Well, let me also be clear. There's a lot of talk about masks, and men need to take off their masks. but we also need to know when to put our masks and our armor back on,
Yeah.
because we are warriors, and our ancestors were warriors. And there was a time that the men would put on war paint or war masks, and they would put those masks on so they could embody the spirit of that war deity, that warrior spirit. But then they would be able to take it off and leave that so they could return to the village, because you can't bring that warrior spirit to the village. That's why the military folks that we send overseas and we ask them to kill and to destroy cultures and landscapes, we ask them to come back and they can't reintegrate because we don't have any ceremonies, we don't have any processes for reintegrating those men and women. So when I talk about the masks, I want to be clear that there is a time and a place to put a mask on and to take it off. We just don't have any context for that. And the danger is that men who never take off their mask and never have a place to release that pressure valve, it boils over to the point where we're all human. We can only contain so much. And then unfortunately you become a headline. You become the man who lost it one day and killed his whole family, or threw himself off a bridge, or shot up a bunch of people at his workplace because he just got sent over the edge. And then we don't talk about that man as a man who was hurting, a man who was suffering, who we as a community, as a society, we failed that person. No, that guy is a villain. He's evil. We won't even mention his name because we don't want to perpetuate this culture of violence. But we make our people that way. That's the thing, is we only take responsibility where it's convenient. We take responsibility for the successes and we discard the failures like they don't matter. And that is like the biggest thing that pisses me off, man. In fact, no one's ever come at me directly, but every time that there's a school shooting or a mass shooting or something like that, I always, on my podcast especially, I always acknowledge the loss and share in the grief, because it's sad and that shouldn't happen. That's not a way for us to treat each other. But I also make sure that at the end of it, I mention the person who did that, because I can't imagine what it must feel like to live with that on your conscience. And maybe you're so far gone, you're so numb to it at that point that you don't feel it as much. But I got to imagine that must hurt. To do that to people, you've got to hurt a lot.
Do you think there's like when you say you speak about it and you, I guess, give some empathy and compassion to that person who, say, shoots up a school, do you think there's resistance to giving empathy and compassion because for people to acknowledge that within someone else means it could potentially be present in them?
Ooh, I like that. I like what you're saying, man. I think that's true. I think there is some truth in that we're afraid of the darkness within ourselves. And people who do those things, who perpetuate that violence, are really just a reflection of that darkness we have within us. I mean, let's be honest. If we were the sum total of all of our thoughts, we would all be sociopathic, murderous villains and thieves and rapists. I mean, we are. I don't believe that we are our thoughts. If we were, then I know I would be in trouble. I don't know about you.
Yep.
So I like to think that we're not our thoughts. We are the actions that we take, the choices that we make. Thoughts, they come and go. That's part of an unconscious process of ego and other neurological things that we don't need to try and figure out here. It's what we do with those thoughts that makes us who we are.
That's
So
awesome.
some people don't have other options than to hurt themselves or hurt other people. And I think that's on them. They get to take responsibility for that too. But I also take responsibility for that as a contributor as well. Because I think there's a lot of ways that we're failing, especially boys and girls, our young ones right now, with the educational system and the lack of emotional preparedness we give them to step into a challenging world. We're not setting them up to succeed, in my opinion.
So how does a man who's suffering, in your perspective, go about reaching out for a guide or for help?
I think about this a lot, and I don't have a clear answer. The simplest answer is reach out to somebody that you trust, somebody that loves you, and just begin to share what you're feeling. It doesn't have to be packaged really nicely. It can be really messy. If, in fact, the messier the better. I'm always so surprised how unique people think that they are, especially men. And then once the veil is removed and they see that there's a bunch of other men circled around them who are crying because they've experienced the same thing, sexual abuse, feeling inadequate, feeling sexually incompetent, financially incompetent, every single one of us has experienced that at some point. We've all got a story. So, to me, there's a lot of power in just beginning the journey of vulnerability. You don't have to unload the whole history book in one weekend or one hour session, but just to begin to share that. Now, I know that hearing that, especially if I'm imagining a man right now who's sitting there listening to this, who's hurting, who's in the bottom of the cellar, that damp, wet, gnarly pit of confusion and turmoil that I know I've been in myself, where you don't see a way out. You don't see how anyone could possibly understand what you're going through. If that's you, or if that's anyone who can relate to that from some point in their lives, just know that there's a lot of people out there who are experiencing that along with you, and people who've been through that previously too. So finding a way, finding some outlet to share in your experience, not even to ask somebody to fix you or give you a solution, but just to verbalize that out loud and see how heavy it feels after you've spoken it, after you've actually given words to your experience that are not just living in your head. To me, that's the only starting point. There's many
Yeah.
ways to go from there, but that's step one.
I've found that anytime I'm in my head and I journal, usually what comes out on the paper, I'll read it and go, what the fuck? Was I
Mm-hmm.
thinking that? It's like, that is so far from the truth, bro. You need to go and do some breath work or something.
Yeah.
And especially like when I did extreme last year, I went into that like completely catatonic for about 3 weeks because I was like, fuck, am I going to have to get naked and people are going to see my penis? Holy shit.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so anxious, man. I was a mess. And then when everyone, eventually took their clothes off, I was like, oh, fuck. I'm just the same as everyone else. And every other
Mm-hmm.
dude in that room, the fear that they brought up was around their penis.
Yeah.
Like, oh my God, I thought my whole life it was just me.
Yes.
But then,
Yeah,
like,
man.
of course, that comes back to like porn and warped expectations and perspective.
So much of that. And I think if I don't know this to be true, but I think if I had an adult in my life that had built up years of trust with, that I could share those things, those fears that were coming up for me when I was in my late teens, early 20s, I think I would have gotten a lot farther, a lot faster than even I did. And I feel like I caught on pretty quick. I was on the path in my mid 20s, and I know a lot of guys who are just getting started in their 30s, sometimes 40s and later. So I'm grateful that I got what I got. But my vision for the future is that, for example, my son, I have a 4.5-year-old son. We've raised him around aunties and uncles his whole life. Not just his blood aunties and uncles, but especially aunties and uncles who share a vision of the world that my wife and I do. And they have their children, and we all have a unique relationship with each child, whether it's our own blood child or it's our little niece or nephew. And I really trust that these little ones who are 4, 3, 2, 1 years old, that over the years there'll be so much trust with each adult that they'll be able to express themselves better than I could, than my wife and my friends could. And that hopefully that ripples outward and becomes the new norm. We're calling everything the new norm these days, like there's actually a norm, but that becomes the way that we do it is forging these close relationships and celebrating and encouraging genuine expression from a young age. Because how much pain could we not prevent? Because I don't think preventing pain is useful. I think providing a balm, a salve for the wound, instead of just letting people bleed for years and years and years without even knowing that there is an option not to. Um, I just get really excited about that, man. And I see it happening all around me. All these beautiful folks, a lot of the names that you mentioned here tonight are doing that kind of work and creating these beacons all over the planet, and everyone's starting to have kids now too. So it seems like it's really all coming together. And there's a lot of people on this planet, so we got a lot of work to do, but I'm optimistic. I never stopped being an optimist.
Me too. It's about, I guess, leading by example, hey, rather than trying to coddle our kids into being what we weren't.
Mm, yes, yes, man, 100%. Very well said.
The last thing I wanted to ask about in your story was you mentioned having to be challenged or go through this initiation process where you're challenged or go through ceremony. What was that for you, and what did you get out of that experience?
Are you asking about the ceremonial rite of passage that I did, or just challenges that I went through at that time in my life?
No, I think you brought up a 4-day fast or something like that.
Ah, yeah, okay. So there's many different forms of rites of passage, and life also gives you rites of passage whether you want it or not. I think of fatherhood, becoming a father for the first time. That's the death of uh, not being a father and the beginning of becoming a father. So that's how that transition thing works. And rite of passage of becoming a married man is single guy to not single guy. So there's many different traditions that have a rite of passage for coming of age, going from boy to man. The one that um, I experienced and that I was trained in is called Vision Quest. It's a 4-day fast that is based off of a Lakota ceremony of fasting in the wilderness in solitude. Um, Now the Lakota, the way that they do theirs is different than what I was taught, but they fast from food and from water. The way I was taught, we just fast from food. We do have water, but we spend those 4 days completely alone and removed of all distractions. And the way I've come to understand it is that by removing so many of the distractions that create noise in our head, that distracts us from that internal voice of truth, that deep internal golden voice of truth. When you strip those away and you spend that amount of time just listening to that voice, clarity comes through. I became very clear about who I was and what mattered to me in my life and my relationships and what I wanted to create. 4 days is all it took. 4 days, no food, by myself. There's people who know where I am and that are checking in on me from a distance, but really not having contact with people and just being able to commune with nature is just such a beautiful process. So and that's what I've been trained in, and that's what I've been offering to men over the past few years, and it's been incredible work just to see how men from different backgrounds, different upbringings and cultures can really connect with that process of putting something to rest and burying it figuratively and literally, and then emerging as something entirely new after those 4 days in solitude.
Something I want to ask, and this is because this is the way I'm feeling. Like when you say 4 days alone with your thoughts, and I'm sure if it's makes me feel this way, it makes others feel this way. It's like, holy crap, that makes me anxious, just
Yeah.
because I know the potential of the darkness of the thoughts. Did you have to go through or purge any of that throughout that 4 days?
It's like in other things. I've done meditation retreats, like 10-day silent meditation retreats, and yoga and exercise. All of them have a breakthrough point. And going back to your initial question about challenge, why is it important for us to go through challenge? Is because challenge and adversity is around every corner. It's not a matter of if you're going to see a curveball, it's when. So these rites of passage and these ceremonies were designed to create a challenging environment for a young man, a boy, to experience for the first time, to see if to prove his readiness for the challenges that face him in his life. Because if you can go without food, go without water, be by yourself, I know that in Australia the Aboriginal peoples have walkabout where they're out in the bush for months at a time, and they get sent off by themselves for periods of it and have to survive with minimal. That was the test. That was the test. Will you or won't you? And if you do, great, you're ready. It's very simple. Yeah.
Um,
So, yeah.
so I think we'll move on to a couple questions before we wrap up, bro. And like knowing where your life was at, you're this guy who was suffering for no purpose. You then go through an initiation, go through these challenges, and now you're a man who, I guess, empowers other men to lead, and you hold space and build that community. What have you added to your life or removed from it to improve the quality of it?
That's a great question. I've removed some of my distractions and some of my vices. I still have them. I have added deeper and more meaningful relationships than I've ever had before. I've added mentors. I've added teachers and guides. I've removed relationships that didn't serve the man I was becoming. That people in my life who, at no fault of their own, just weren't on the same path that I was. And I've added uh, a lot of distinctions that simplify my life instead of make it more complicated. That's the parallel work that I do. We talked a lot about the ceremonial side and the rites of passage, but I also have years of experience sitting on a men's team in a men's circle where we really cultivate that masculine energy of simplicity, of logic, of solutions, of power and direction. And combining those two worlds to me has been incredible. It's the only way I've been able to be father, husband, rites of passage guide, podcaster, business owner, influencer, etc. Man, it's the only way is by bringing those two things together.
That's amazing. And I feel like tapping into that, it gives us a chance to own, like fully own and embody that masculine. Because I feel, especially having gone through like that Me Too movement and all this toxic masculinity stuff, that a lot of guys felt like they had to detach from that. Otherwise, they'd be considered as one of those guys.
Yeah, I know we don't have much time, but I've always been a staunch advocate for the safety of women. I've just always been that way from a young age. I think it's just how I was raised and what's been in my DNA. And when Me Too came around, obviously I think there's a lot of justice that was served to people who are getting away with despicable things. But it also swung the pendulum really far in that direction to a point where it's been really hard to be a man in this world at this time. Not to say that having a high standard for how we show up as men that's important too, but it was a very broad stroke that was cast, and even the arrival of a term like toxic masculinity, I don't use that term. I don't accept that. I don't think that there is a such thing as toxic masculinity. I think that there are misguided masculine powers and misused, but to me, those aren't men. Those are boys who weren't initiated, who didn't have proper guidance and weren't prepared to step into life as an adult. But because they looked like an adult and because they met certain criteria, we decided that, okay, you can operate and function in the world as an adult and have adult responsibilities. But again, we failed those people. So another topic for another day, but I think you catch my drift.
Yep. No, but I fully agree, man. Absolutely do. What are you most grateful for right now?
Oh man, the simple things in my life, truly, I'm grateful to always have exactly what I need to take care of my family and myself, and to have just enough left over to give back in the best way that I can.
Awesome. So if there are any men who are listening, any men out there who come across this and who are suffering, who feel like they need guidance or to go down that route of some sort of initiation, rites of passage, or just be in your bubble or your network, how do they get in contact with you? How do they find you?
Mm. Well, you can go and check out everything that's going on with the Rising Man at risingman.org. You can follow me on Instagram at Jeddy Azuma, or on Facebook. You can friend me, Jeddy Azuma. I respond to all DMs and messages whenever I see them. And so anybody who wants to connect with me and get to know me better, you just got to reach out, say, hey, I love starting conversations. So find me, because I know you see me. I don't always see you guys because there's a lot of you out there. But hit me up.
Awesome, bro. So to end this, to wrap this up, I just want to acknowledge you for, first of all, making the time to do this. You said you like having conversations, and I think you replied to my message pretty damn fast. And I was actually surprised you said yes so fast, because usually it's a process trying to get to yes. So thank you for that. But most of all, thank you for having gone through what you've been through, going through that initiation process, having those challenges, overcoming them, and now being this man in this space who is teaching other men how to lead, especially like with that energy that you show up with. To have these people in our space all having the same, I guess, perspective of you or experience of you is a testament to, I feel, the man that you are and the way that you show up, bro. So thank you.
Thank you, Lockie. I appreciate that, man. Thank you. I really received that. It's been an honor to be on here. It's easy to say yes to requests like that because I know what it takes, man. And I just want to turn it back around and acknowledge you for 122 episodes, man. That's no small feat. You're doing amazing. And for everyone who's listening, make sure, however you can, support this man in his efforts. If you get at least a shred of something for your life, make sure you at least send some love out to Lockie in whatever form that you can, because we do this because we love it, and it's a labor of love. There's a lot of hours behind the scenes that go into doing what you and I do. So thank you for your service and your contribution, and for giving me a platform to share my words too, man. That's super valuable. Thank you.
Thank you, brother. Have a good night, eh?
Yeah, you too.